Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Dr. Maya Ellison. Today, we go back to Los Angeles, to a city on edge in the late 1970s, and into a case that left neighborhoods terrified and families broken: the Hillside Strangler murders. This episode is heavy. We will walk through the crimes, the investigation, the survivors, the courtroom drama, and the threads that still don't add up. My guest is Professor Daniel Rios, forensic psychologist and criminal law scholar. Daniel, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Maya. It's important we talk about this carefully. The facts, the victims, the system that failed them, and the psychology that both explained and obscured what happened. I'm ready.
All right. So let's set the stage. Los Angeles, late 1977. The city was already rattled by notorious crimes earlier in the decade. You know this. But there were other factors that made the Hillside killings particularly terrifying. Traffic, sprawl, the feel of being watched from the hillsides. Women were moving into public life more. Second-wave feminism was changing how women worked and moved about. But policing and public institutions still often dismissed violence against women, especially sex workers. Daniel, if you had to sum up the atmosphere in one sentence, what would you say?
Fear had a geography in LA then. The hills, the freeways, the Strip. It was a sprawling city where anonymity was easy, and the distance between people could be lethal. People felt like the city itself turned on them.
Yes, and that geography matters. Between October 16, 1977, and February 17, 1978, bodies began appearing on hillsides: Griffith Park, Elysian Park, near Dodger Stadium, Glendale Hills. Early on, the press used the singular, the Hillside Strangler, and that image of a single, unstoppable predator created a kind of mythic dread. But the reality was more complicated and, frankly, uglier. The first victims were largely sex workers and runaways. Later victims included students, waitresses, aspiring actresses. The transition in victims changed the public response. Why do you think that mattered, Daniel?
Because when the victims were women, society already marginalized. The system treated their disappearances as isolated tragedies rather than a pattern. Once the killers started taking women from middle-class neighborhoods, daughters of working families, students, it became personal for a broader swath of Angelenos. That's when urgency shifted. It's a pattern we, sadly, still see. Social status shapes investigative energy.
Exactly. And that misclassification early on is one of the still unanswered threads we'll return to. But first, we need to talk about who did this. There were two men at the center: Kenneth Alessio Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. Both were born in Rochester, but their paths led to very different and deadly dynamics in LA. Daniel, let's start with Kenneth Bianchi. His early life reads like a litany of red flags: adoption, family dysfunction, uresis, pathological lying. How much weight do we place on early childhood pathology when we try to understand later violence?
It's important context, but not destiny. Bianchi's developmental history, abandonment, lying, temper problems, and early sexual humiliation reports, sets up vulnerabilities: identity instability, poor impulse control, a craving for power. But most people with traumatic childhoods do not become killers. We need to see those early issues as risk factors that interacted with adult choices and social dynamics, including his relationship with Angelo Buono.
Right. Buono, older, more established, with a long criminal record. Pimping, domestic violence, petty theft. He ran an upholstery shop in Glendale that became a site of unspeakable abuse. Eyewitnesses and survivors described him as controlling and sadistic. The dynamic between them was not equal. Bianchi looked up to Buono. Buono exploited that. I want to pause here. One-word reaction, Daniel.
Predatory.
Predatory. Let's be specific about what they did. The MO was horrifically consistent. Impersonating police officers, flashing fake badges, ordering women into an unmarked car, often Bianchi's Cadillac, then transporting them to Buono's shop or home. Victims were bound, raped, tortured, sometimes with electricity, sometimes with chemical injections like Windex, and ultimately strangled with ligatures. Bodies were cleaned, moved, and dumped on hillsides. That cleaning, wiping down bodies, removed crucial forensic traces. Daniel, from a behavioral standpoint, what does the fake police routine tell you about their psychology?
It tells you they studied authority and how to weaponize trust. Posing as police does three things. It provides instant control, it reduces immediate resistance, and it feeds a fantasy of omnipotence. For someone like Buono, who craved dominance, the role is intoxicating. For Bianchi, who sought approval, participating in that role affirmed his place in a hierarchy he otherwise lacked.
Yes, that abuse of trust, of a uniform, is a theme that echoes forward to today. Now we should walk the timeline of victims to center who these women were. We'll name each and talk briefly about their lives, not just case numbers. I'll read names and a short human detail. Yolanda Washington, 19, early sex worker in Hollywood, often dismissed by media as just a prostitute. Judith Miller, 15, reported as a runaway. Elissa Caston, 21, a dancer with a promising career. Dolores Cepeda, 12, and Sonja Johnson, 14, two girls gone without reason. Christina Weckler, 20, an art school student with puncture marks from Windex injections. Evelyn King, 28, aspiring actress. Lauren Wagner, 18, a business student grabbed in front of her own street. Kimberly Martin, 17, an escort who was lured via an agency. Cindy Hutzbeth, 20, whose car became her tomb. Each of these names carries a family, a life, plans. Daniel, tell our listeners why collapsing their identities into mere victims does a disservice.
When we erase individuality, we erase motive for empathy and justice. Each woman had relationships, futures, jobs, people who loved them. Recognizing the full personhood, the art student who drew, the 12-year-old with friends and homework, forces us to treat investigations as moral imperatives, not just sensational headlines. It also helps explain why some leads were missed. Marginalized victims don't get the same social investment.
And that social investment mattered in the pace of investigation. Early reports described bodies of sex workers washed and left, and investigators sometimes labeled those cases as drug-related or incidental. Only after bodies turned up from middle-class neighborhoods did the police form a multi-agency task force. I want to talk about a survivor whose testimony tells us a lot about the escalation, Sabra Patterson. Sabra was forced into prostitution, beaten, and, she says, nearly asphyxiated with gas. She escaped and went into hiding for 2 years before coming forward to testify against Buono. Daniel, how crucial was Sabra's testimony?
Enormously crucial. Sabra provided lived experience of the domestic torture dynamic, the pattern of sexual slavery that prefaced the murders. Her testimony showed these men weren't just opportunistic killers. They maintained a system of control that normalized escalating violence. In court, accounts like hers give prosecutors narrative structure beyond forensic data. They show motive and routine.
And Sabra's story also exposes the chilling fact that the killers experimented injective chemicals, electric shocks, asphyxiation attempts, which we later see reflected in wounds on victims like Christina Weckler. These were not random acts, they were laboratories of cruelty. Now let's move to investigation. The task force built a profile, a white male, blue-collar, comfortable with fantasy of authority. Yet one of the chilling ironies, Kenneth Bianchi went on ride-alongs with LAPD officers who were hunting the hillside strangler. That's almost Kafkaesque. Daniel, what does that say about the limitations of profiling and policing at the time?
Profiling is probabilistic, not prescriptive. It narrows suspicion but can't see every variable, especially when the offender infiltrates institutions. Bianchi's ride-alongs show how someone can both mimic law enforcement and exploit it. Also, investigative fragmentation and the lack of forensic tools, no DNA as we know it, left detectives chasing patterns rather than definitive links. The killers took advantage of that gap.
And the gaps mattered. Forensics at the time relied on fibers, hairs, blood groups. The bodies had been wiped. Witnesses were scared to come forward. The media clamored for details. Leaks happened, and tips flooded in, including false confessions. Then came the break. Bellingham, Washington, January 1979. Bianchi had moved north, found work as a security guard, and killed 2 women, Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder, after luring them with a fake house-sitting job. He left enough physical evidence, links to the house, fibers, timeline, and was arrested. That arrest connected him back to LA. Daniel, walk listeners through the forensic leap from Bellingham to LA.
Certainly. Once Bianchi was arrested in Washington, investigators looked at his history and realized he had been in Los Angeles during the Hillside timeframe. They cross-checked vehicle registrations, addresses, rent records, and witness descriptions. Although they didn't have modern DNA, physical linkage through things like rental agreements for the Glendale apartment, his Cadillac sightings, and his own statements created probable cause. Plus, Bianchi eventually confessed, and that confession, however self-interested, provided narrative detail only a perpetrator could know.
But that confession opens another problematic chapter. Bianchi's attempt to use a dissociative identity defense, claiming an alternate personality named Steve Walker committed the murders. He apparently switched voices and mannerisms and tried to convince everyone he had multiple personalities. Daniel, you teach forensic courses where this is a classic example. Tell listeners how that unfolded and why experts concluded he was faking.
Right. After his arrest, Bianchi claimed DID, saying Steve Walker was responsible. The defense briefly pursued insanity. Experts like Dr. Martin Orn were brought in. Orn and others found the presentation inconsistent with genuine DID. The alters were too scripted, the switches too performative, and Bianchi appeared to have researched DID symptoms. When examiners demanded depth and consistency, the kinds of dissociative histories you see in true DID, he produced additional, convenient alters on cue. That, combined with motives to avoid the death penalty, led the evaluators to conclude the disorder was feigned, malingering.
And yet, that hoax mattered beyond Bianchi's case. It fed public misunderstanding of dissociation and gave defense attorneys a template, while also fueling sensational headlines about multiple personalities. Bianchi then agreed to plead guilty in Washington and to testify against Buono in California in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. That move reframed the entire narrative. The hillside strangler was 2 men. But it also raised a painful question. Did the deal distort the truth? Daniel?
Deals always complicate truth. Bianchi had every incentive to shift blame, minimize his own role, and shape testimony to save his life. Prosecutors got convictions because it was pragmatic, but reliance on a confessed killer as star witness invites reasonable doubts about the completeness and accuracy of the account. That said, corroborating testimony and circumstantial evidence tied Buono to crimes as well. It's messy. The legal system often embraces imperfect trade-offs to secure convictions.
Messy is the right word. Buono's trial in the early 1980s became, at the time, one of the longest and most expensive in California history. Bianchi's credibility was repeatedly attacked by the defense. Yet, the court heard survivors like Sabra Patterson and other witnesses that built a picture of Buono's sadism. In 1983, Buono was convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to life without parole. Judge Ronald M. George said he would have imposed the death penalty if he could. That sentence mattered to many. But still, some families, and many in the public, felt justice wasn't balanced because Bianchi had avoided execution through cooperation. Listener reaction? I'll just say, complex.
Absolutely. You can empathize with both sides. Prosecutors wanting to guarantee at least one life behind bars, and families wanting the harshest punishment. The trade-off was painful, but typical of cases where a cooperating defendant provides the thread to convict an accomplice.
Now, we have to talk about a darker cultural sidebar, Veronica Compton. She was an aspiring actress and a woman deeply infatuated with Bianchi. After his arrest, she corresponded and visited him, and in 1980, she attempted a copycat murder, trying to stage a strangling using Bianchi's semen sample to suggest he was innocent or that the killer remained at large. She lured a woman to a motel, tried to strangle her. The victim fought back and survived. Compton was convicted of attempted murder, sentenced to life, and later paroled and reincarcerated before final release. She died in 2023. Daniel, what does Compton's story tell us about fame, obsession, and hybristophilia?
Hybristophilia, a sexual attraction to people who commit crimes, is one aspect. But Compton's actions also show how narrative can be weaponized. She wanted to shape the story, to elevate Bianchi's mystique, or to control the trajectory of his case. It's a cautionary tale about how charisma and media attention can create dangerous convictions in the public imagination, and how that can motivate third parties to commit violence for notoriety or to protect someone they love.
And her attempt introduced more mess into an already tangled legal and moral knot. Moving on to the aftermath. Buono died in prison in 2002. Bianchi, who legally renamed himself Anthony D'Amato in 2023, is serving life at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla and has been denied parole multiple times, most recently a denial in 2025. He continues to file appeals and make claims of coercion. There are also countless dramatizations and documentaries, films, TV movies, and recent MGM Plus docuseries that retell the case and include survivor testimony. This cycle of media keeps the case in public view, but it raises ethical questions. Daniel, how do you see the cultural appetite for serial killer stories intersecting with survivors' needs?
There's a tension between public education and exploitation. Responsible documentaries can highlight victims and systemic failures, helping prevent future crimes. Sensationalized retellings commodify trauma, recentering the killer and erasing survivors. We should demand media that prioritizes victims, contextualizes systemic bias, and avoids glamorizing perpetrators.
That's the editorial stance of this podcast. We center the women. We name them, we look at institutional failures, and we come back to the still unanswered questions. First, were there more victims than the official count? Officially, 10 in LA and 2 in Washington are the accepted numbers. But Laura Collins, killed in September 1977 in Griffith Park, and other unsolved cases were once linked to the pair. Jurisdictional fragmentation, misclassification as overdoses, or domestic disputes could have masked additional murders. Daniel, is it plausible that the full body count is higher?
It's plausible. Serial offenders sometimes have disappearing acts, crimes in different jurisdictions or bodies never found. The chaos of the late 70s, limited forensic capability, poor interagency data sharing, could allow related murders to fall through the cracks. However, without forensic linkage, we can't claim more with certainty. The possibility remains, and that uncertainty is part of what haunts families and investigators.
Another unresolved thread: the Rochester alphabet murders in the early 1970s. 3 girls with double initials murdered there. Bianchi grew up in Rochester, worked as an ice cream vendor near 2 of those scenes, and drove a car similar to one witnesses reported. He was never charged, and he denies involvement. Daniel, how seriously should we treat that connection?
We must treat it seriously but cautiously. Circumstantial overlap, geography, vehicle similarity raises reasonable interest, but forensic evidence is necessary for an accusation. Investigators have to balance suspicion with proof. The alphabet murders remain unsolved, and Bianchi's potential involvement represents a credible lead worth re-examining with modern techniques if evidence exists.
We should also examine the systemic bias question again. Did police indifference to sex workers and runaways delay the investigation? Some retired detectives insist they did what they could. Critics argue the killers would have been caught sooner had early victims been treated with the same urgency as middle-class victims. Which side do you lean on, Daniel?
The reality is mixed. Individual detectives often worked hard, but institutional priorities and bias matter. Victim status influenced resource allocation and public pressure. The cases of marginalized women frequently receive less investigative energy, and that pattern likely slowed recognition of the serial pattern. It's a structural issue that contributed to the duration of the killings.
And that structural issue continues to echo in modern investigations, in how we prioritize victims, allocate resources, and interpret victim behavior. Another thread we must untangle is the bad faith around Bianchi's DID claim and how it shaped popular understanding of dissociation. His malingering made courts more skeptical of DID claims, which may harm genuinely dissociative survivors who need psychiatric recognition. Daniel, how do courts now guard against malingering while not disenfranchising real patients?
Forensic clinicians use standardized assessments, corroborative history, and careful longitudinal observation. The difference between genuine dissociation and feigned disorder is consistency across contexts, documented trauma histories, and symptom patterns that emerge outside of interrogation. Courts now rely on multidisciplinary assessments and are more cautious, but stigma persists. Bianchi's case is often taught as what not to do, which can be both instructive and troubling for genuine patients. Daniel, how do courts now guard against malingering while not disenfranchising real patients?
Let me push you on one more legal point: the use of a cooperating serial killer as the star witness. That was essential to convict Buono, but it raises ethical questions. Are we privileging expediency over absolute truth? How does that sit with you?
It's a trade-off. Prosecutors often face binary choices: accept a plea and secure conviction for at least one defendant, or risk acquittal of both. Using a cooperating defendant can bring about accountability, but it also introduces incentives for manipulation. The justice system tolerates this because it values some closure over none, but that doesn't make it ideal.
One of the more visceral reactions families had was to Bianchi's name change in 2023 to Anthony D'Amato. Many saw it as a manipulative rebranding. He's also repeatedly claimed varying degrees of innocence or coercion at parole hearings. The parole denials, including a 2025 denial, cite the cruelty and number of victims as reasons to keep him locked. Some families still attend hearings. Some survivors give statements. What message do parole boards try to send in cases like this?
Parole boards weigh public safety, remorse, rehabilitation, and the nature of the original crimes. In cases of particularly brutal and numerous murders, the board often leans on the severity as a gauge that parole would be inappropriate. Denials signal that society sees these crimes as beyond the threshold for release, regardless of time served. Boards also consider ongoing risk and whether the offender has accepted responsibility, and Bianchi's shifting narratives undermine his case for release.
Let's bring the conversation to a close with the unanswered questions that matter most to families and to policy. We've already listed possible additional victims, connections to Rochester, whether there were more accomplices, and police response. I want to add a community question. How do we honor these women and change systems to prevent repeat patterns? Daniel?
We honor them by centering their stories, funding cold case units, improving data sharing across jurisdictions, and treating violence against marginalized women with the same urgency as other victims. We also reform policing cultures to remove biases that deprioritize certain victims and expand access to trauma-informed care and victim services. That's how we turn memory into prevention.
Yes, and as a criminologist and former victims advocate, I believe remembering must be concrete. Better cold case work, better interagency coordination, and public pressure for accountability. Before we end, I want to read a passage that has always stuck with me. It's from a detective who worked on the case. What we lost in those hills was not only life, it was the idea that the city could keep us safe. That line, it haunts me. Daniel, any final thoughts for listeners who may be new to this case but feel unsettled?
If you feel unsettled, let that feeling move you toward curiosity and action, not voyeurism. Read names, support survivor organizations, push for resources for cold cases, and remember, crime stories are about people, not puzzles. Empathy matters.
One more short note. If any listeners are researching this case further, the documentation is scattered. Court transcripts, People magazine retrospectives, academic analyses, and the recent docuseries. We'll include source references in the episode notes, but approach them critically. Some accounts sensationalize, others sanitize. Always look for victim-centered reporting. Daniel, thank you. This was difficult but necessary.
Thank you, Maya. Difficult conversations are the ones that change things.
We'll be back on Still Unanswered with more cases where the system failed and where questions remain. For the families of Yolanda, Judith, Elissa, Dolores, Sonja, Christina, Evelyn, Lauren, Kimberly, Cindy, Karen, and Diane, we say their names here, and we keep asking questions. Goodbye for now.